Good morning and welcome back. I'm Samuel Goldman, an assistant professor of political science here at George Washington University, and also a senior contributor to The American Conservative. And I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel on national security, state overreach, and reform, reclaiming civil liberties in the aftermath of the war on terror. We have three distinguished and interesting panelists, Adam Serwer of MSNBC, Marcy Wheeler, who blogs as Emptywheel, and Conor Friedersdorf of The Atlantic. And the panel will follow the model of the first session with statements of about 10 minutes from each panelist, followed by a few questions from me, and I hope questions from the audience. But before turning to the panelists, I'd like to exercise the moderator's prerogative of offering a brief introductory remark. But I'm a professor, so when I say a brief remark, I mean a long and pedantic remark. And I'd like to begin the panel by observing that in American politics, the freedom of religion is sometimes described as the first freedom, and that's because it appears first in the First Amendment, which itself introduces the Bill of Rights. But I think there's a case to be made that our real first freedom is found a bit later in the Fourth Amendment, which, as everybody knows, holds that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And what I think is important about the Fourth Amendment is not simply that it subjects searches, seizures, interrogations, and surveillance to the test of due process, but also that it seems to introduce a moral principle, which is that searches must be reasonable. And I interpret this to mean that merely following the appropriate legal procedures isn't good enough. According to our legal and constitutional traditions, the people have a right to live their lives free from intrusive scrutiny, even if it is authorized by legislation. Well, of course, there are real threats to national security and to the lives of citizens, and we wouldn't want to minimize those. But it seems to me that a question that we might use to begin, or at least to pose as an overarching concern, is what the Fourth Amendment means in an age of terror and modern communications, and how we can recover the spirit or moral principle, at least as I've interpreted it, while protecting ourselves against these real threats. So to help answer those questions, and no doubt to raise new ones, we'll turn first to Marcy Wheeler, followed by Adam Serwer, and then Conor will have the last word before we turn to discussion. So Marcy, please.
For a piece for Cato that was published yesterday, I think yesterday, I've lost track of time, I argued that the administration's response to the Snowden leaks was to double down on hard power at a moment where what the United States had been doing with the internet, which has been an important part of our soft power projection for years, and tech companies, which have been an important part of one of the bright spots in our economy for years, they instead turned and kind of doubled down on hard power and using the internet as a tool of security rather than as a tool of reaching out as Americans. Obama paid lip service, I think, to not spying on Europeans as much. He paid lip service to not weakening encryption standards, but those are unenforceable, and there's no means to ensure that they're weak. So, and I think that bespeaks to a model of knowledge that the United States has kind of adopted of late, which is this notion that we can and should know everything, that the approach to terrorism is to be all-seeing, right? It doesn't work that way. One of the things we learned in the IG report from the Boston Marathon attack is that the NSA actually had collection on the Tsarnaev brothers before the attack that they just had never accessed. We don't get to learn about that. We don't get to know exactly what the NSA had, but I think it's, that plus the warnings from Russia ought to have more discussion, but nevertheless, the NSA was all-knowing about Tsarnaev, and it did us no good. And there's an irony there, because that has come, I think, both bureaucratically and by choice with this increasing commitment to SIGINT. So in other words, we're going to ensure America's place in the world solely through, or increasingly through, this technical omnipresence. And that's led to the atrophy of HUMINT. I think there are probably great human intelligence spies out there, but I think, we've got the HUMINT people driving drones right now, and less and less people who are collecting themselves, which leads us to rely on partners like Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Pakistan, who maybe don't have the same interests that we do. So there's this system of knowledge that I think is hubristic and dangerous and isn't actually serving American interests very well. And it comes with a kind of enemy. The notion behind it was that there are terrorists among us, and therefore we have to go and identify those terrorists, and the only way to do that is through this omniscience. That notion of enemy, and I think we'll probably talk about this more as we go forward, is beginning to leach out into other areas. Certainly within, if you look at Anonymous or if you look at WikiLeaks, I think that the model of searching for terrorists has been used to at least some degree with those targets as well, and there's this very dangerous prospect that it can be used more broadly and can be turned on genuine dissidents and can be turned on people who are genuinely just criminals within the United States. And after I published the thing for Cato, I was like, the reason I think that the government did this, that they've doubled down, is the cybersecurity threat. People forget that in that hearing where James Clapper, now we remember, he lied about collecting on millions of Americans. I actually, in real time, called him on that, and I said, that's a lie, and that's going to come back to haunt him. Boy, was I right on that one. But the headline that actually came out of that hearing, so March of 2013, was that cybersecurity, for the first time, was the intelligence community regarded cybersecurity, cyber threats, as the biggest threat to the United States, not terrorism anymore. And during the response to Snowden, the government downplayed that, partly because I think they didn't want to talk about, there are different threats to privacy if you're using this dragnet for cybersecurity purposes than there are if you're using it for terrorism. Plus, terrorists make a very nice boogeyman, and the cybersecurity threat is a lot more amorphous than that. But it is, and I frankly think there are still Snowden documents that describe some of the ways they're using these tools for cybersecurity. I know there are actually, that they're using them for cybersecurity that haven't been discussed as we discuss quote unquote reform. And that's important because Congress has repeatedly refused to give the NSA the lead on cybersecurity in this country. Nevertheless, the President's Review Group alluded to it very strongly. They said the NSA should not be a domestic security force. When asked about that, the explanation was that they are playing this domestic security force in cybersecurity. That still remains very opaque to us, but it is very much a real threat. And I think to solve the Fourth Amendment issue, I think it's not the terrorism thing that you really have to solve. You have to solve the cybersecurity thing because it is a real threat, right? I mean, I don't want to minimize the degree to which, and we talked earlier about state versus non-state actors, and cybersecurity is something where both of those adversaries can strike at the heart of the United States. And we need to recognize that. But I think one of the things that has happened in our discussion of cybersecurity is that we've conflated many things in what counts as cybersecurity. So one of the kinds of cyber threats that the government has most aggressively gone after is anonymous, which some of what they do is legal, some of what they do is illegal, some of what they do is horribly embarrassing, but it's not an existential threat to the United States, and it's curious that that's been sort of early on was the lead approach for the government to combat cyber threats. Then there's China robbing us blind, right? And it's actually funny because that's what everyone wants to, there's this line that Sheldon Whitehouse, Keith Alexander, a number of other people use. They say that cyber theft has been the biggest transfer of wealth in history, ignoring colonization and slavery and some other things. But I mean, it's a remarkable statement to make, unself-critically. But so China is robbing us blind. But it's funny because what China is doing, you can argue about economic espionage all you want, but that's still traditional spying. Stealing our war blueprints is spying. And when Russia was taking us out to lunch in the Cold War, spying-wise, we didn't cry and say, "Oh my gosh, they're breaking the rules and spying," right? But one of our primary responses to China is to say, "Oh my gosh, they're breaking the rules of spying." No, they aren't breaking the rules of spying. And rather than really, I think, addressing the urgent need to bring security to especially our defense contractors, we instead are trying to pretend there's rules about spying. And then there's crime, which I think, and we can talk about this. This is an area where there's some really interesting Fourth Amendment issues that are being played out now. One of the things that DOJ wants to do is be able to get like a nationwide warrant so that they can go to a judge here in DC and be able to go literally hack into servers all over the country to target cyber threats. That's going to be an interesting debate, but at least we're having that debate publicly, which I think is which is important. If we can have a debate publicly about how to combat cyber theft, I mean, talking, gangs breaking in and target and stealing everyone's credit card information, that's the kind of cyber threat that most Americans are going to care about, identity theft and losing their credit card. But that's also that's an area where we are actually having legitimate debates, which I think is useful. And then the last threat, which gets conflated in, is threats to our critical infrastructure. And this is the big fear-mongering of late. Mike Rogers very amusingly last week said, Google is unpatriotic for not being willing to give up its European markets because they're opposing the reform bill before Congress. But we have to take these measures to protect these banks that transfer $7 trillion a day. And he didn't notice, I think, because he talked about them at different times, that Microsoft is going to be asked to sacrifice for the banks. But the problem of critical infrastructure, and I think both state targets and non-state actors could legitimately strike at us, is we don't talk about America's resilience. PG&E in California has to be one of the most critical players in cyber critical infrastructure defense because they're one of the biggest utilities out there. But PG&E all by itself, through neglect, was able to cause a catastrophic explosion in San Bruno. And the same things that led it to not fix its infrastructure there in San Bruno are the same things that lead it to be less than adequate for cybersecurity. But we're not going to address the physical infrastructure problems. The big threat everyone's worried about now, right, is Wall Street. Oh my gosh, people can come and break Wall Street. Well, in 2008, Wall Street managed to break themselves without a single hacker's involvement. And yet we don't ask Wall Street to make themselves, we're perfectly tolerant of Wall Street being non-resilient even still. Dan, I hope, is still out there and he can argue against me that it worked. We haven't hardened Wall Street. Wall Street is still incredibly rickety. And until we do those things, until we ask these private entities to hardened themselves against cybersecurity. I think the notion that this should be the big fearmonger thing to let the NSA into our back pockets is really problematic. So I think we will have an interesting discussion about cybersecurity going forward. I actually think the reform bill serves some cybersecurity purposes without telling us. I think it brings back the internet dragnet, and I think it expands upstream collection. But I think that with regards to the debate, we need to be really careful about not conflating the various threats that are before us. I think we need to point to the FBI's success at combating actual crime and use that as a model rather than necessarily putting the NSA in our back pocket. And I think we need to talk about resiliency as a country generally, because it's, arguably climate change is at least as big a threat as cyber threats, and resiliency is going to solve both of those problems, or at least mitigate both of those problems.
Thanks, Marcy. Adam?
Okay, well, so it's been about a year, a little more than a year, I guess, since the Snowden disclosures. It's been almost a year since the House came within a handful of votes of defunding the Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which is cited as the authority for the NSA's phone dragnet program. And we've seen, very little in the way of legislative reform. Certainly nothing has passed yet. There's a bill in Congress. And that's despite the fact that two government panels in the executive branch concluded that the program wasn't very effective at preventing terrorism. That's despite some, consistently brutal press in terms of the scope of the program, how effective it was, and how dishonest intelligence officials were about describing its scope. And that's also despite some fairly big hitters on both sides of the aisle trying their very best to get something passed. I'm speaking, of course, of Sensenbrenner and Leahy. And I guess I'd like to make a few observations about why I think that that's the way it is. And first one is, I'd say that partisanship is not enough. There's this sort of theory that, sort of partisan self-interest can serve as a vehicle for legislative reform because, when one party controls the White House and the other party controls Congress, whatever they're going to be selfish and they're going to want to nail the other guy, and so they're going to go all out in order to, change things so they can really stick it to them. But that's not actually what's happened. No matter what party is in power, no matter which party is in the White House, the intelligence community usually gets what it wants. And we saw this in 2009 with, Russ Feingold tried to pass a set of reforms that was very similar to what Sensenbrenner and Leahy came up with in October last year. And Congress was controlled by Democrats in the House, Democrats in the Senate. And Feingold's reforms didn't even survive the Judiciary Committee. I mean, at the time, he sort of joked, he called it the Prosecutors Committee. And he said he was scratching his head as to how a committee controlled by a wide Democratic margin could support the bill it approved. I don't think there should be much of a mystery about that anymore. I mean, the fact is that legislators, whichever party, are very solicitous of the intelligence community for a number of reasons. But if the intelligence community generally says that something is really bad or that they need something to do X, legislators from both parties are going to listen, and it actually doesn't matter how much they hate the guy in the White House. You can hear Republican legislators talk about Obama as an iron-fisted dictator, and then they're going to hand the keys to everybody's personal information to him in a second, just like that. There's of course a big status quo bias in the system. I think that can be overstated, but I also think it's at the same time underappreciated. The system is set up not to allow abrupt changes in it. Whether or not you think that's a virtue or not, it's certainly the case that it's true, and it's very difficult. You look at something like gun control, whichever side of that debate you're on. We had a series of very emotional incidents involving mass shootings, and Congress didn't do anything about it, and that's in part because of the composition in Congress, but it's also in part because even with widespread public outrage over a particular issue, that's not necessarily going to spur legislators to act. As far as And again, I'm going back to this again, but the intelligence community always has a lot of influence on Congress. You can see them getting hammered in the press, and you can see legislators grandstanding in committee hearings, trying to show that they're independent and they're really sticking it to them. But the truth is that when push comes to shove, they're quietly going to do what they say. And one of my favorite examples of this was in 2009, Senator Al Franken made a big show of explaining the Fourth Amendment to David Criss, who was then the head of the Justice Department's National Security Division. And Criss was sort of in disbelief. He said, he couldn't believe that he was being humiliated like this by Franken, who then turned around and voted for the very bill that Russ Feingold said, had been produced by the prosecutors committee. So there's a lot of showmanship for the cameras, when the cameras are on, and when the cameras are off, and the sausage making happens, legislators tend to act very differently. Congress would often, to the extent that Congress is going to do something, they would rather be seen as do something than necessarily do something. That's not actually a joke. It's funny in sort of a sad, hashtag LOL sob kind of way. But it's true. I mean, and there's a sort of, I think there are times when getting something is better than nothing. Half a loaf is better than none when it comes to legislating. But there are times when I think you want to say you're getting half a loaf when you're really just sort of trying to look like you're working. And the most recent reform bill, which almost every civil liberties group has now said is inadequate and has withdrawn their endorsement of, which you saw in the debate on the House floor, was a lot of guys a lot of legislators who've worked very hard to try and rein in the NSA, defending a bill that really doesn't do that at all. And Nadler was on the floor, and Nadler has been, a stalwart civil libertarian on these issues, and he said, a no vote today would mean no reform at all. And of course, the retort from civil liberties groups is that no matter how you vote, this bill means no reform at all. But I think in general, Congress, people were genuinely angered by the Snowden disclosures, and Congress did want to be seen as doing something. And I think that augurs well for the passage of the bill, but it doesn't actually mean that the government's surveillance powers are going to change in a way that substantively curtails what they're able to do in terms of getting people's information, private information, without having to go through a rigorous oversight process. Another reason why things have gone the way they've gone, I think, is that these issues are really hard. The policy details are difficult. You're talking about, an age group in terms of legislators who are people often who are, very used to communicating on paper, let alone, email and text messages and everything else. Like, the technology is like genuinely, but even for someone who's young, the technology issues are difficult to grasp. And there are very few members of Congress who get it. And something you might say is, I wrote a piece last year about why this happens. And, these legislators vote on intelligence bills that they often don't really understand. And someone said, well, the classic response is, well, legislators vote on stuff they don't understand most of the time. And maybe that's true. But most of the time, there's someone on the legislator's staff who understands it. And that's not necessarily the case with an intelligence bill, because on the Senate side, you have at least one dedicated staffer who's cleared, who can talk to their boss about these things. On the House side, they're pretty dependent on the committee staff. For example, Sensenbrenner's staffer who wrote his Freedom Act bill was completely cut out of the negotiations with the administration over what to include in the final version of the reform bill. This is not something I reported. This was in CQ. But I think and he didn't have the sufficient security clearance. So what you have is a situation where you have some legislators who, for one reason or another, may not be the best prepared to grasp these particular issues, who don't have the necessary staff to help them grasp it. And there's another aspect to this too, which is that I think it's a little harder for the public and for the media to grasp it as well, because it's not like health insurance. Like healthcare policy is very complicated, but almost everybody has to pay a health insurance bill. Student loans are complicated, but a lot of people have to pay student loans. And with government surveillance, there's not the same direct impact on your life where you're dealing with it every month and you're like paying a bill. It's a lot more abstract, I think, for a lot of people, not just legislators. And so it's easier for people, I think, to get lost in the details and not necessarily follow with what's happening. And rely on what politicians are saying when they're saying, oh no, we're really fixing this thing and we're really making sure that American civil liberties are being protected. So I guess, that brings us for full circle. And I think, when the Snowden disclosures happened, there was a very strong argument that however you felt about these powers, secret government, and this is going to sound, like a complete oxymoron, but to function, the American national security state has to have a certain amount of democratic legitimacy. And when what they're doing is so secret that we don't even have a general idea of what they're doing, then that legitimacy is lost. And I think that's what happened with Snowden, was that what they were doing was so far beyond what they were saying what they were doing, was that it couldn't really be said to have a democratic legitimacy to it, because you had all these legislators who were voting on it, who didn't understand it, who were voting not to let people, not to disclose the kind of information that would allow people to understand it. But now that those details have come out, we're on the verge of something I think for civil libertarians should worry them a lot more, which is that we're on the verge of granting that democratic legitimacy to this system, because now that all the disclosures have been made and Congress is going to ratify that system, one of the administration's defenses of the NSA program is like, this is passed by Congress, this is validated by the courts. Now, after this bill passes and after not much changes, that's actually going to be true. This will have been passed with everybody's knowledge of at least to some extent, what was happening, and they're going to be able to use that to justify it in a way that they couldn't justify it when Snowden's disclosures were initially made. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Adam. Conor.
I wish I was here today with one big idea for reforming the national security state, a silver bullet. I have a lot of small ideas instead. I'll start with the one that's most likely to fail, which would be to elect an Illinois senator who makes a lot of big promises and says all the right things about executive power and the national security state, and then wait for him to fulfill his promises. I'm beginning to think that's not going to happen with Barack Obama. In fact, at this point, I wouldn't be shocked if he retires in a few years and goes to Texas and starts painting dogs in watercolor. America has always gone a little bit crazy in times of war. We can look back in our history and see what, in hindsight, are clearly excesses. The Alien and Sedition Acts, suspending habeas corpus, harassing German Americans during World War I, and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And we see this pattern where the war ends and there's this course correction. And I hope that when Barack Obama was elected, we were seeing the course correction. Of course, we actually saw him continue a lot of the policies of his predecessor. If an avowed civil libertarian like Rand Paul ever makes it to the White House, I would hope that he would fulfill those sorts of promises. But I've mostly resigned myself to the fact that no Republican or Democrat who is elected and installed in the White House is ever going to voluntarily give up power. And at this point, focusing on the presidency as a vehicle for our hopes is a distraction from a more achievable goal, and that's electing a Congress that takes civil liberties and the separation of powers more seriously than the Congress that we have right now, which is terrible. But I actually think a better Congress is a totally realistic goal. I think that here in official Washington, D.C., military interventionism and the national security state are much, much more popular than almost any place else in America. Most places in America don't get better restaurants because of the largesse of the national security state, for one thing. The Beltway consensus is sustained by people like Eric Cantor. For years, his constituents were happy to be represented by a patron of the national security state, right? But as we just saw, his constituents were also happy to be represented by a staunch critic of the National Security Agency. It's not because public opinion has shifted on that particular issue. I'm not saying that that House race or any House race in America turns on the issues that are dear to me or dear to the ACLU. I'm saying that voters, Republicans and Democrats, are perfectly happy to be represented by civil libertarians, but only as kind of an afterthought. For most people, these are peripheral issues. That explains how the same Kentuckians who sent Rand Paul to the Senate also decided to keep Mitch McConnell around. It's a shame, I think, that voters haven't placed a higher priority on staying out of wars, on NSA spying, and on civil liberties, because, like everyone up here, I think that they're very important issues. The silver lining is that it isn't as if voters have carefully weighed all sides of these things and decided that the national security status, as I call them, are correct. There's no reason that Congress has to be as hostile as it is now to reining in the national security state. I live in California, and its voters would be perfectly comfortable with a senator who was as good as Ron Wyden of Oregon, say, on the NSA stuff. Instead, we're represented by Dianne Feinstein. She's terrible on the NSA stuff. There's no reason that her replacement couldn't be better if civil libertarians went about a sustained campaign and was able to persuade just a little bit of the public to care a little bit more about these issues. So I think replacing Dianne Feinstein with a Russ Feingold or a Wyden is an achievable goal. I think that replacing national security state-loving Republicans with politicians like Mike Lee or Rand Paul or Justin Amash is an achievable goal, and that civil libertarians in both parties can work on these goals within their respective parties. I think that, often I'll talk to people who do care about staying out of wars, they're upset about Iraq or upset about civil liberties, and they want to vote for a candidate who's a little bit better on these things, but they say, well, I just had Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. They're not really going to be different on these issues. I'm just going to vote for my partisan affiliation. And in this way, focusing on the presidency causes people to overestimate how difficult affecting meaningful change can actually be. It makes people hopeless and apathetic. Very few voters who care about the NSA, who care about the spying, who read about the Snowden things, even among them, they don't know how their own congressman is behaving on these issues, and that can change. Now, I'd argue that if the civil liberties factions in the two parties are going to be nudged in the right direction, there are other changes that would be extremely helpful. On the right, I think that Republicans with libertarian or originalist impulses are going to have to think carefully about what it really means to defend liberty and to uphold the spirit of the Constitution. What should their priorities be if those are their kind of big picture goals? And a small increase in the marginal tax rate may be prudent, just may not be. But we should be able to agree that it's a less urgent affront to liberty than these assaults on the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. I think that folks on the right often don't realize the importance of civil liberties even to the issues that they do care about. You talk to someone from the NRA and mention the idea of a national gun database, and they're horrified by that idea, that the government would know everyone that owns guns. Well, if government can track all of our phone calls and emails and financial records, it's effectively the same thing. And you get a room full of 30 or 40 NRA members, and you kind of explain how this could come to be, how you could have the actual equivalent of the thing that they're scared about, but it's happening in the surveillance realm instead of the gun control realm, and maybe you win converts. And I think that these small kind of battles and getting at these issues in orthogonal ways can be really effective. I would argue that among Democrats, there has to be a greater recognition that when culturally blue cosmopolitans like Barack Obama or Michael Bloomberg trample on the rights of minorities or foreigners, they're just as contemptible and worthy of opprobrium as culturally red figures like George W. Bush or Joe Arpaio when they have policies that do similar things, even if they're better at cloaking the liberal policies in pretty language. I think that Democrats should also reflect on the relative contempt that they heap on various political figures. The Iraq War will cost probably $6 trillion in the end, and it killed about 5,000 Americans. Again, to go back to Eric Cantor, he supported it. But his opponent, right, is portrayed as the kooky, crazy Tea Partier. I can't think of anything that his opponent has supported that's worse than the Iraq War, that's more actually damaging, demonstrably damaging. And Cantor still thinks that that was a good idea. So I think that we need to start to see the craziness, the relative craziness of establishment Washington for what it is. If you have people coming from the left or the right who are challengers, they often do say or think certain kooky things, but how important are those things in the grand scheme of things? I think Republicans and Democrats alike continue to underestimate the importance of war as an issue. This is evident, for example, in talking to Democrats who have always opposed the Iraq War and who always thought that it was a bad idea, but still want Hillary Clinton to be their party standard bearer in 2016. They agree with her on a lot of domestic issues. They believe she's best positioned to defeat the Republican, and that's fair enough. But to me, if you look at the damage done by an ill-conceived war of choice, by an Iraq or a Vietnam, it's the most damaging policy that you can have in a country. And if you really take that seriously, then avoiding future wars of choice, avoiding putting a reflexive hawk in the White House should be a huge priority. I don't see that as a priority even among anti-war Democrats right now. One last point. As an opinion journalist, a lot of my time is spent trying to inform my readers about the national security state and also to persuade them to look at it a little bit differently. And there's kind of an endless amount of work to be done on that front because it really is shocking the amount of time that federal officials willfully mislead the public, tell outright lies sometimes, often will offer technically accurate statements that are egregiously misleading. And they often get away with it because broadcast media especially is very deferential to anyone with U.S. official by their name, but also because, like Adam said, the subject matter is very complicated. And I try to expose this dishonesty in all its forms. One example, I read about drone strikes a lot, and you hear the Obama administration characterize drone strikes as surgical, right? And it makes them sound very sterile and exacting. And I don't know about you, but if a surgery was about to go down in the building next door, I wouldn't worry about my safety. Surgeons make mistakes. It's very rare that their right hand slips and takes out someone in the next building. This happens with drone strikes, right? And it's just an absurd metaphor that people throw around all the time, the surgical drone strike. So, it's very easy to think about rhetoric and the way that it's used, and for me to write about this and hopefully change the way that people respond to drone strikes by thinking of the language that's used. But it's much easier to call out the way that someone like Keith Alexander, who just stepped down as the head of the NSA, the way that he misleads an audience. He's very, very good at it. He's very good at saying things that are technically accurate, but that are actually very misleading. And figuring out what exactly it is, how exactly he's misled you, often, for me, it takes reading his statement 3 or 4 times and then having 16 tabs open on my Firefox and having it crash 3 times, and I have to pull it back up. And then finally I get at it, like, that's the tricky thing that you slipped in there. It's a full-time job, and I'm a generalist, and I don't write about the NSA all the time. I write about a lot of things. For doing the job of really digging into these things, I'm constantly indebted to people like Marcy, whose blog is indispensable on these things. Also to people like Julian Sanchez at Cato and Trevor Tim at the Freedom of the Press Foundation and Jason Leopold, who does a lot of FOIA requests throughout the national security state and the federal government. And it's hard, thankless work to unearth these facts that are far too deep in the weeds to attract a mass audience, but they're critical both to informing elites that are making policy, as well as journalists who are trying to give mass audiences the most accurate overall impression possible. And I couldn't do my job at The Atlantic nearly as well without them. Also, other generalists like Adam who see things that I don't see, partly drawing on other sources, partly doing their own reporting. These things really matter, and they filter through the rest of the media ecosystem, and they eventually get down to the level of the important business of persuading people all over the place that things are not as they're being told by U.S. officials, by the national security state. And so in addition to all the other things we talk about, if you want to do something about these issues, support those people who are doing that thankless work. And I guess I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Conor. And in the spirit of asking experts to articulate issues that are beyond the understanding and the knowledge of laymen and even non-laymen, I thought we might spend just a little while talking about the USA Freedom Act and what it does and doesn't do. Rand Paul, Ron Wyden, and Mark Udall published an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times today criticizing the bill in its current form for its shortcomings. What are those shortcomings, and how serious are they for people who care about these issues, but also see the necessity of working with the Congress that we have rather than the one that we might wish to have?
I can run down, and then you guys can explain what I just said. The bill purports to end bulk collection. The way the intelligence community defines bulk collection is anything without a discriminator, without a selection term. So in other words, they now admit that the phone dragnet is bulk collection because ostensibly they can get all the phone records in the United States. So as soon as they use any kind of discriminator, however broad, they then no longer consider that bulk collection. What we call upstream collection, 702 upstream collection, where they sniff the packets that cross the telecom switches and pull certain things, certain emails, certain phone numbers, certain malware signatures. That stuff collects in a year at least 56,000 communications of Americans that are completely unrelated or completely innocent, domestic communications, yet they don't consider that bulk collection. The original Internet Dragnet program was targeted at certain switches, where presumably ones that served the Middle East, and that wasn't considered bulk collection because they used discriminators, these switches where more potential terrorist traffic will cross. So the current bill ends bulk collection by requiring a specific selection term be used before you collect anything. It applies to Section 215, which is used for the phone dragnet. It applies to the Pen Register Act, which was used for the Internet Dragnet, and it applies to national security letters. That's not going to work. And it's not going to work because the way they define specific selection terms includes things like entity. Al-Qaeda is an entity. And so you could say, I'm targeting Al-Qaeda and pick and say what they said in 2004. All of these switches are switches where Al-Qaeda's traffic crosses, and therefore we need to collect all of the data off those switches. In addition, they use a term, they say here the specific selection term includes blah, 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 such as, and they are currently using that such as term, or they did when they testified before the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, to hide some of the more privacy invasive upstream collection selectors. So in other words, that such as is so broad, and they are hiding the most troubling aspects that they plan to use, that should be thrown out. And then also in the bill there's this basis for. So if I'm going to do a pen register, I'm going to use a specific selection term as a basis for picking which switches to collect. Again, each of these involve interpretation, can get broader. So the bill doesn't really end what you and I would think of as bulk collection. It ends what the intelligence community thinks of as bulk collection. And they will say, James Cole, the Deputy Attorney General, has said, well, you know, the congressional record says that you don't want bulk collection, so it's kosher. And in fact, on the House side, I don't think people figured out that they were using the intelligence community definition of bulk collection. Therefore, they were laying a legislative record that served the purposes of the intelligence community. People figured it out as the bill was passing the House floor, and people like Zoe Lofgren were saying, you could use this to collect, it's funny, people are saying you could use to collect all of the phone records from a zip code, and that's the one, this is Keith Alexander's latest trick, although it's not Keith Alexander doing it. They say, well, no, it wouldn't be used to collect all the phone records from a zip code. What they won't say is, no, it wouldn't be used to collect all the phone records from an area code, which is how they use it, right? There'd be no reason for them to collect all the phone records from a zip code. And besides, zip codes are generally more narrow than area codes. So that's an example of the game they play. They deny the thing that they're willing to deny, but not the thing that they might get in trouble for. But nevertheless, the DOJ is currently ignoring what is clearly the congressional intent on FISA going back to 1978, on whether defendants get review, on whether DOJ is required to inform defendants that Section 702 has been used to collect on them. So it is an act of incredible bad faith to say that the legislative record that for 38 years has not bound them under FISA is all of a sudden going to start binding them, because it's just not going to happen. And there are other ways where the bill, I think, the bill at least gets judicial review before you can do a phone dragnet. Good thing. The judge is not reviewing whether the judge is reviewing whether the target is an agent of a foreign power or associated with a foreign power, not whether the target is a terrorist. So, in fact, the bill expands the use of this dragnetting function beyond the use of counterterrorism. It does so in several different ways, which actually reverts back to what they were doing until 2009, and it was considered a violation at that point. But now they're going to have it legislatively approved, and so, and there's a couple of other ways it's qualitatively worse, I think. But the one other way that it's important for you to know that it's qualitatively worse is that right now, when Keith Alexander has testified about this, he's always said, Anwar al-Awlaki calls people in the United States, they call people, and 3 degrees of separation from phone calls made by Anwar al-Awlaki. All those people get sucked up and thrown into the NSA's maw, and they can do anything. The full analytical might of the NSA is thrown at these people. In 2012, FISA approved the contact chaining on connections. And I have no idea what that means. It's behind a redaction in the primary orders from FISA right now, but it presumably means at least they're using burner phones. So if I throw out my phone, they're going to find my new phone by figuring out my call patterns. But it almost certainly is also going to include geolocation. So right now, all 4 of us are chained, not because we've ever called each other, but because our cell phones are sitting next to each other. And who knows what else it's going to cover. We know overseas the NSA is using things like address books and photos, and I'm missing a few, to do the same kind of contact chaining. So we should assume that they might want to try to do that with this approach, and that should scare everyone. Or it should at least alarm everyone that we are approving it blind again, not understanding what connection contact chaining is.
And I think that this all raises a kind of larger big picture question, and that's what kind of surveillance policy ought we to have? And I would say one feature of it ought to be that you could sit down with a room of educated people and explain to them what the government can do and what the limits are on what the government can do, and have it be comprehensible to them. Honestly, I don't think that is the case with the reforms being pursued.
You're saying I wasn't comprehensible?
I'm saying that, one of the reasons why Marcy's blog is indispensable, I cover this stuff quite a bit and try very hard to understand it. And she'll lay something out as clearly as anyone could possibly lay it out. And it'll take me 3 times reading it to understand all the nuances. This complication is not a coincidence, right? This is complication is a good thing for the national security state and its lawyers, especially because you can find a national security lawyer, if you're the president, to tell you almost anything is legal. The idea that we're going to have a reform with this degree of complication that the NSA a few years from now won't wriggle out of somehow, to me seems highly implausible. And so I would go a lot farther restricting them and demanding transparency than anything that will ever get through Congress, unfortunately.
Adam, would you like to add anything?
Marcy mentioned the 702 program, so that's what governs, what everybody, I think now colloquially known as PRISM. And one of the interesting things about the Freedom Act is that it doesn't touch Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. That's right, it's a law that is an acronym, that contains an acronym, yeah. But
that has nothing to do with complexity.
Right. But so So what 702 does is it authorizes collection of actual communications, and it's supposed to be targeted at people abroad. But functionally, what it means is that, as Marcy said, domestic communications of Americans get swept up in it, and we're talking content here. You know, Barack Obama likes to say nobody's listening to the content of your phone calls, but 702 does actually sweep up content, and it does sweep up Americans' content. And technically, they're not supposed to target it, but if they get it, they can listen to it. And this is what's called a backdoor search. And that anything to do with that was completely eliminated from the bill, much to the anger of Ron Wyden, who says, you know, he's going to fight to get it back in. But you know, that was one thing that I think Marcy mentioned, but it deserves to be emphasized, is that there's a lot of things that were meant originally to be in this bill that aren't in this bill anymore. And I would say the way the ACLU, which is sort of tentatively at this point, I think, supporting the bill, although I think they may eventually withdraw their support, they refer to the bill as authorizing "quote unquote" bulky collection instead of bulk collection. And so that, I mean, that should let you know what it actually does. Prior, you know, before Snowden, they were doing, you know, quote unquote 3 hops. When they were collecting people's records, that is 3 degrees of separation from you know, a target. And this allows 2 hops, and then allows them to keep those records. So, you know, 2 hops is potentially the records of hundreds of thousands of people. You know, so, you know, fine, we're not getting every single Verizon customer anymore, but you're still getting a lot of people. And like Marcy said, I think that's still, you know, by any colloquial use of the term, that's bulk, even if, you know, legislators would prefer you not refer to it that way.
Well, in the spirit of conversation among educated non-experts, I'd like now to open the floor for questions. I think that we have time for just 1 or 2, so please come to the microphone and speak into it so that C-SPAN can record your question.
Adam, what are your thoughts about the danger of the national security state using all this information to blackmail their opponents?
Well, look, I mean, American history has a lot of pretty prominent examples of dissidents having their personal information used against them. Martin Luther King being the obvious example. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was, you know, behaved practically like the mob in terms of the use of private information to coerce people. We haven't seen that exactly yet in the United States, but the risk is always there. I mean, you know, and it's not even controversial for legislators to bring this up. They talk about this when they talk about why the National Security Agency's powers need to be reformed. But I think, you know, eventually, the more that people become used to the idea of the government watching them all the time, and the more that it shapes their behavior, the more it becomes part of the plan. You know, I think the more likely it is that government is going to feel more comfortable doing things that would have, you know, before seemed inconceivable.
And there's a degree to which, if the government has a sufficient amount of information, they don't necessarily have to go so far as to actually say, I'm going to blackmail you with this. You just know that they know everything, and so you're a little bit more docile, a little bit less likely to make waves. That's not true of anyone. Of course, there are going to be dissidents who are going to object no matter what, but not everyone is that courageous or that willing to give up their life. And I think that, you know, the so-called chilling effect is a very real thing that changes the way that people relate to the government in a surveillance society. You know, and you see this not just with the NSA, but for example, if you think about facial recognition technology and the ability to take a picture with a digital camera of a crowd and to now identify everyone in that crowd. Can you imagine a future war and an anti-war protest that you might be a little bit less likely to go to if you knew that you could be identified by name just as easily as, you know, an FBI agent taking one picture and sort of mapping the whole crowd? I think that would dissuade some people from going to an anti-war protest, and I think we're going to see technology outside of the surveillance we've been talking about raise those issues a lot more in the very near future.
Well, and they're doing it anyway as well with collecting your cell phone. They'll go to protests and they will collect all of the cell phone numbers that are present at the protests. So it's the same kind of thing, that you're seeing this collection of selectors at a very localized level and data sharing back and forth. And so the threat is very real for that.
Another thing that's off the radar are license plate scanners, where cities all over the United States are installing these license plate scanners that just take a little photograph of every car that goes by and are generating just mounds and mounds and mounds of data. And they're not all connected yet, but it would be so difficult to transition this into a system that basically tracks all car trips. And of course, if you're carrying a cell phone, there's a redundant tracking of all car trips.
Except in Florida, on the 11th Circuit.
Well, yes, we have time for just one more question.
I'm more concerned about torture, assassination, keeping people locked up without trial for years on end. And yet, the Snowden Revelations surveillance seems to have gotten more attention, more people aroused than some of those other issues. Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Because they actually affect people in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to say it, but like America, things like indefinite detention at Gitmo and drone strikes and torture, those things happen to someone else. And I think when the Snowden disclosures came out, when that FISA court order was leaked, it said they were taking Americans' records. And if you recall, it was last year, right before the Snowden stuff came out, we were having this big conversation about the use of executive use of lethal force against American citizens with drones, and there was this whole Rand Paul and Eric Holder thing going on. And that's what people were talking about, and that animated people, even though there's the possibility of a drone incinerating you at a Starbucks in Milwaukee is like not high at all. Whereas that kind of thing happens at weddings in Pakistan, often. I mean, not often, but like often enough to where it seriously affects people's lives. And as long as it's happening to other people, I think, in some ways, particularly during a time of economic hardship, it's harder for people to care about it.
Even within the United States, you've seen the NYPD put together not digital surveillance, but like actually putting undercover officers into student groups of Muslims, not because they were suspicious of the particular student group, but really just because they were Muslim. And it had this whole program that ultimately generated 0 counterterrorism leads, which gives you an idea of how much reason there was for them to be suspicious in this way of these particular people. And actually putting someone undercover in a group full of college students who I think went river rafting at one point. Like one of these undercover agents went on the river rafting trip and befriended them. And this is, arguably surveillance much more intrusive than anything that the NSA is doing, and yet it caused much less of an uproar, I think, because people had they were Muslims. And I think that there is a double standard that's gone on since 9/11. The Snowden revelations were different in that it wasn't a foreign people, like Adam said, it wasn't an ethnic minority in the United States where people could think, well, I'm not them. It was everybody.
And they're all, it's important to understand that they're all connected. John Brennan in his confirmation hearings actually admitted that he had used stuff that came out of the CIA's interrogation program in declarations to the FISA court. They have to go to the FISA court and claim bad threat. Well, if that came from torture, then the dragnet we're talking about is all derived from this fear-mongering that derived from torture. They actually use the dragnet to find informants, and then they send the FBI out to go find it. So it's all interlocking. But I do think it's true that average white people see themselves as targets of surveillance in a way that they don't see themselves as targets of indefinite detention or having our faith communities infiltrated or what have you.
Well, if I may, again, exercise the moderator's prerogative and take the last word, it seems to me that A final reason is that torture, war, drone strikes, although certainly abuses, don't cut at the heart of our possibility for self-government, the way the prospect of full surveillance does. And I think that may be one reason, too, why it's attracted so much resistance. Unfortunately, we have to conclude, so I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists.